we're going to talk about your assignment for this week. And your assignment is long exposure, low light and night photography. So this is just sort of a fun way to get some images that may be a little bit more challenging to work with in Lightroom. And that's what we're going to kind of work on this week, is a slightly more challenging imagery. So when you're shooting at night, you're going to possibly end up raising your ISO. And ISO is really just stands for International Standards Organization, and it's the governing body that sort of deals with the sensitivity ratings for cameras and film. I think we've talked about it before, but when you raise your ISO, what you do is you increase the noise level in your image. So you can see the image on the left is the low ISO, and as we move through the steps, we get higher and higher, and we start to get more of that noise or that grain look and that texture. You can really see it in the sky. And so we want to really be careful of our ISO, because the higher we get, the less detail we'll end up with, or fine detail we'll end up with in our image. So for your night exposures, you're going to have long exposures, potentially high ISOs. You're going to need to use a tripod. You're going to need to use a remote or the smartphone app or the self timer on your camera, so that when the camera starts taking the exposure, you are not touching the camera. There's also a setting in your camera called mirror lockup that's usually in the custom settings. And if you have a camera with a mirror, not shooting with a mirrorless camera, the mirror flops up and down and can cause some small shake in the camera. So you could lock the mirror up so that it doesn't flop back and forth. But you're going to want to do something so that you can trigger the camera without physically touching it, or not touching it when the shutter actually triggers, right? So you're going to want to stabilize it. And the best way to do that is with a tripod. If you don't have a tripod, there's a number of other ways to stabilize it. You can set it on a table or some other object that will stabilize it out. Another thing that works really good is like a bean bag, or if you don't have a bean bag, you can go buy a bag of dried beans at the supermarket, and you can kind of set that bag of beans down and nestle the camera in it and get it relatively, or actually pretty darn stable, and then take your picture that way. But it does need to be stabilized. You cannot handhold night photography. It does not work. Now, when we talk about taking your night photos, there's a few different things that you can do. We can just take a long night exposure. We can do a long exposure and then use like a flashlight or your cell phone light to paint an object in it. And we can draw an object like we see in this image here, or we can use that light to light up objects so that different things show up in your photo. And I'm going to show you a few examples of all of those. So this one is a long exposure, and we've taken a flashlight or a cell phone light, and we've gone into the shot, and we keep moving as the person in the shot, and we're wearing something dark so that we don't show up. And we aim the light back at the lens, and we draw something. And you end up with this light trail. It just basically is trailing out the light everywhere that it moved that the camera saw it. And you can draw whatever you want. This is a good chance to use the bulb exposure on your camera, where it stays open as long as the button stays pushed. And you can kind of try that out and see and experiment with that. Another thing to do is the long exposure, and you can actually utilize cars and buses and other things going by to get those light trails as well. So instead of using a flashlight or something to draw in those light trails, in this case, there's just traffic going by, and that traffic is creating these lines of light from the lights that are on each of the vehicles. And you can kind of see that going through. So those become blurs of light, and everything else becomes very sharp and still. And you can see that there's some people on the right-hand side, and they stood relatively still for the bulk of the exposure. There is some people just to the left of the two people that are standing still, and they just sort of look like a darker spot in the light trails. And those are people that are moving. And so the more they're moving, the less they're going to show up. You can also kind of play around with some tricks of, during the long exposure, have some element of your photo move, right? So this is two people that are sitting here, or one's sitting and one's behind him. and then they started the photo, and then the person that's behind him moved out of the frame partway through the exposure, which turned him into a ghost. Now you can see that the person sitting down is slightly blurry, and that's because it's a long exposure and they were just sitting there trying to be as still as possible. So if you look at like the detail on their sweater, on the shoulder, on their right shoulder, there's a fair amount of detail. There's actually texture in the sweater as well, but their eyes are a little bit blurry, which means their head was moving more than their body. And so if you do a long exposure with a person in it, be careful about the movement that the person's going to have or make. You can also use a flash or a strobe to light somebody up for an instant in the middle of the photo. So this person had some sort of lights maybe on their shoes or just wrapped around them. And so those lights created light trails. And then at some point in the exposure, a flash went off and exposed them for that split second. And then the exposure continued and they became the ghost. But they're mostly lit because that flash went off sort of at an instant. So it's kind of like painting with light, but with a flash as well. Here's one with painting with light, using something to gel the light, to change the color of the light. So they have a red light, they have a green light, and then they have a white light. So you see they have red light on the ceiling inside the bus, a red light underneath the bus, the green light just inside the door, and the white lights in the headlamps of the bus. And they very easily could have put those white lights in the headlamps just by walking up and shining the light straight into it so that it reflects back at the lens. They don't show up in the shot because they're moving constantly throughout the shot. And it's a very long exposure, as we can see by the star trails in the sky, right? You see those lines in the sky are stars over a longer period of time. So this exposure is many, many seconds, probably well beyond 30 seconds of exposure, which means they had to use the bulb setting on their camera. And whatever you paint with that light will turn whatever color the light is. And whatever you don't paint, in this case, is being probably lit by a full moon or a nearly full moon, which is just a giant reflector that's reflecting the sunlight back at our shot. So there's a thing called the 500 rule. And if you're taking photos at night and you want the stars to show up as dots and not lines, then you need to adhere to the 500 rule. And the 500 rule basically says that you divide 500 by the focal length of your lens. So if we had, let's go with a normal lens, a 50 millimeter lens, we could divide 500 by 50, and we're going to end up with 10. And so you can see on a full frame sensor that you're going to want to have a 10-second exposure or shorter in order to get the stars to show up just as dots and not as lines. You can go shorter than that, and that's fine as long as you can get a nice exposure. Now, the other thing to remember is the higher your ISO is, the more noise you're going to get, and the more noise you're going to get, the less you're going to see the stars. So you might think, oh, I'll just ramp up my ISO so that I can keep my exposure down. It's a little bit of a catch-22 there because you're going to lose some detail in there. So this is just a general rule. If you're not worried about seeing the stars as individual points, then you can let your exposures go longer and you'll get those lines like we saw in the last shot. There is sort of that balance where you can find just before you hit this point or a little bit after where the stars are maybe slight lines but almost dots. And it's totally up to you as to what you want it to look like in your shot. So this is a shot that I did out in Death Valley, and you can see some car lights sort of right along the midpoint of the horizon back there, those white, yellowy white lines. The stars are mostly dots. This is one of those ones where I made the decision to let them go just slightly off of being a dot because they pretty much look like a dot, but they are just little lines. And everything else in this shot is lit by a full moon. So the full moon is actually so much brighter than you might think. And you can go out and take photos utilizing a full moon and get nearly a daylight looking shot. So there's shadow, there's texture, there's detail. and there's stars in the sky. So this one was probably it's a 24 millimeter lens, and I think it was about a 30 to 40 second exposure at maybe ISO 1600, right? I found kind of a mid ISO so that I didn't get too much noise, but a high enough ISO that I could keep my exposure down just a little bit. Here's one that I did in Sedona, and this is actually a panorama. So this is, I believe this is 3 photos that I shot, and then I put them all together. We'll be talking about panoramas later on in the semester, and you'll get a chance to do those. The mountains and the trees are all lit by the moon. And that glow that you see are the city lights and cars that are driving around. And so I kind of found the balance of exposures that got me both of those. And I found a vantage point that kind of highlighted everything that I wanted to see. And you can see that this is a relatively long exposure because the clouds are a little bit blurred because they're moving. Here's another one from out in Death Valley, and this is a 3-shot panorama as well. And the stars stay fairly distinct because I kept the exposure relatively short. The rest of it is lit by the moon, and then that glow coming from the mountains or behind the mountains right in the center of the shot is actually the lights of Las Vegas that are reflecting off of some clouds in the sky. So you can kind of balance all of these things out and create something sort of interesting. Now, this is one that I did up in Great Basin National Park, and this kind of shows a little bit of how I put this one together. So this is 2 shots. One of them, the one on the left, is just of the stars, and I kept the exposure as short as possible so that I could get absolute points of the stars. And then that sort of cloudy space that you see in the middle there is actually the Milky Way that I'm capturing. It's Great Basin National Park is actually a designated dark spot in America, and it's got almost 0 light pollution. And so you can see the Milky Way. When the sun sets, the Milky Way comes out, and you can just see it with your naked eye, and makes it very easy to photograph. And you can see that when I do that short exposure, in order to get the Milky Way, and this was with no moon out, that makes the foreground super dark. And it's kind of interesting, but it's way more interesting when the foreground has some light. And so in the second exposure, I actually refocused my camera to be focused on the tree. And I had a little light with me. And I started my camera and I stepped around to the right and shined the light back at the tree so that I'm getting some highlight side and some shadow side to the tree. And I can really see kind of the texture, the form, and the shape to the tree. And then I put the 2 images together in Photoshop. This is sort of a more advanced technique on it. I welcome you to give it a shot. We're not really a Photoshop class, but if you have questions about it, I can answer questions about it. Just send me a message and we can walk you through that, or come to the office hours and I can walk you through that as well.